We're delighted to have you here today to join us for a discussion on partner remuneration, specifically thinking about trends, pain points, and what firms are changing in 2026. So let's get stuck in. I'm going to start by asking our absolutely brilliant panel to introduce themselves to you, if I may. First of all, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Corinne Staves. I'm a partner here at CM Murray. I'm going to come to my excellent partner Zulon to lead those introductions.
Hi everyone. Hi, I'm Zulon Begum. I'm also a partner at CM Murray, and I specialise in non-contentious partnership law.
Fantastic. Thanks, Zulon. Rob, morning.
Morning. Hi, Rob Millard. I am with Cambridge Strategy Group. So strategy in all its guises. Recently, that has always included AI. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Rob. Morning, David.
Morning all. David Shufflebotham, I suppose expert in partnership remuneration and evaluation of partner contribution that ties in with remuneration. And really interested to talk about how AI is starting to affect that particular area.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, David. And last but definitely not least, my brilliant colleague, Wonu. Morning, Wonu.
Morning all. My name is Wonu Sanda. I'm a senior associate at CM Murray. I advise law firms, professional services firms, and partners on a full range of partnership law and employment law issues.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Wonu. Really great to have you all. Really great perspectives to come from our panel. So should we just get stuck straight into the topic, please? I think I was going to start just by launching the discussion by setting the scene, really. And maybe, Rob, you can help us do that. We're obviously experiencing a period of change. I mean, I know you often hear that, but I think it is probably true as well, with lots of changing pressures on professional services firms and their partners. And they include economic pressures, the kind of the impact of technology on the sector and the way that we deliver services to clients. And I wondered if, Rob, you could sort of talk to us a little bit about that, about how firms are reacting and how you think firms ought to be reacting.
Great. The conversation's about compensation and performance, so let's focus it on that. And I think just to, if we're going to talk about how firms are changing and thinking about changing, perhaps the best way is to think about what's keeping managing partners awake at night these days on this topic. And I think the most important thing is the question, is our compensation system actively penalizing AI adoption? We've got all these initiatives going. We know that we have to adopt these new tools, but we're still measuring largely on output and billable hours and similar metrics. And not only compensation, but the whole firm is hardwired around that. And that status quo is protected by the most senior, the most valuable partners typically. So that's the first question. The second would be, okay, if we switch away from those metrics, then what is the unit of account that we should use? I mean, we be counting value delivered, outcomes, matters closed? I don't. And what does that mean in the most practical of terms? And of course, everything's interconnected. If we switch to doing that, are we going to have our most valuable partners suddenly taking calls from headhunters who say, if you go to the other firm down the road that is far more performance driven, then you'll earn a lot more money? So there's that, keeping them awake. And the next one is, where does profit actually come from? If the pyramid is shifting, if we've got the juniors falling out because AI do that work, and we've got partners closing matters in 40 hours instead of 80 hours, where does the profit come from, and how do we price that value rather than just hand it on to clients? Because all this is upstream of the performance and of the compensation question. Then we can also add in, how do we pay for the tech that we need to buy, the AI and the other? It's not only the technology that's a cost, it's also the cost of implementing it. How do we pay that in an environment where we distribute profits every year and we have to compete heavily to pay market-related comp to our partners? So I think that sort of sets us the scene for how our leaders are thinking and how it's influencing the way that they look at this topic.
Thanks, Rob. I mean, difficult to cover so much in such a little amount of time that I gave you, but thank you. You've really whet our appetites with some of those key themes. Thank you very much. And I wonder, David, if you wouldn't mind kind of coming in now and sort of talking to us about those factors that Rob's outlined there, and talking specifically about the impact that you're seeing it have on partner compensation and the systems for partner compensation within professional services firms.
Yeah, thanks, Corinne. Thanks, Rob. This is moving pretty quickly, and I think there's a bit of a lag in terms of how law firms are responding. And you'd understand that for the very reasons Rob has outlined, especially given how entrenched the current systems of partner remuneration are within the industry, but very much within individual firms. Whenever I get instructed to help a firm with potential changes to their system, one of the first things you've got to do is look out to see where the trade-offs are within any changes. How are the biggest billers, let's call them that for now, the biggest billers, that might change, how are they going to be affected, and therefore will they be in favour of any changes? So if you put that in the context of AI and say, well, what's changing here? Where is, as Rob says, where does that profit, where does that value actually come from and get generated? Is it coming from a different place, or is it still coming from those relationships that provide the flow of work? I think we are in the foothills of finding out what is changing, but it certainly is going to change. And to that point about what you're asking partners to do, I think there's two things going on. There's the efficiency aspect of how things are changing. Rob's point about closing deals in 40 hours rather than 80. So the billable time is now no longer a real reflection of the value created. But maybe they can close 2 deals in 80 hours. Maybe there won't be any diminution of the need for lawyers, partners, junior lawyers on that basis, because we've been there before with, compare, right? I remember doing proofreading when I was a junior lawyer. I remember sending out and couriering documents to people. You don't have to do that anymore, but it doesn't mean that the need for junior lawyers has gone away, as an example. So there's the efficiency side and there's the transformational side. So the way actually law is the practice and the product and how it's delivered. As that changes, that really throws everything up in the air. But going on to what changes I am seeing, so I think law firms are really in sort of counterpoint to what Rob says. Lots of law firms are really, really sort of recalibrating their focus to say, guys, look, in this uncertain world, we really need to make sure that we're delivering profitable revenue. And we're in a period where, for a variety of reasons, firms have adopted over time broader sort of balanced scorecards and objectives-focused means of evaluating partner contribution. But I'm certainly seeing a recalibration there, so that those elements of balanced scorecard and objective setting are being seen very much in the service of the core revenue and profit delivery, as opposed to being the way in which you get to the profit delivery itself. And of course, it is symbiotic. You can't have one without the other. But I think that recalibration is definitely happening from the firms, and whether that's AI driven, whether it's just the uncertainty of the VUCA world we're living in, etc. I don't know, but that's what I'm seeing.
That's really interesting, David. And would you say that that's, and perhaps you'll tell me it's too early to say, but would you say that's delivering kind of better results and better sort of viewed through the prism of the specific firm's objectives, or in terms of driving greater profitable work within that firm?
Yeah, it's tricky because I think that your balanced scorecard and your objectives are really, really good at aligning partner focus with strategic intent. What sometimes gets left behind is the day-to-day focus on the knitting. It can do left behind. I'm not saying that it always happens, but I think the firms have just sort of shifted slightly towards that financial recentering on the financial metrics, and not paying as much attention to how people are doing against their objectives, and maybe on the balanced scorecard. But that's always been there, really. But it's a recalibration rather than complete throw everything up in the air type of change. And yes, it does depend on where a firm is in its profitability journey.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. And I think, Zulon, that one of the things that we very often see as practitioners is that often the system, whether it's been recalibrated or not, is sort of fit for purpose or broadly fit for purpose. But the problem is often the implementation of the system and the adherence to the system, in terms of the assessment of the criteria, kind of the measuring of how successfully partners are delivering against those criteria, and specifically reporting back to the partners on what the areas for development are, sort of really forcing that requirement for development and maintaining that paper trail. And we particularly see that in an exit context, don't we? Do you think that there's been any change in that? Or do you think we're going to continue to see those sorts of themes?
I think broadly the themes will always be there. I mean, I think the single biggest source of risk in any kind of partner exit situation is not normally the decision itself. It's usually whether the firm can actually evidence consistently and objectively why that decision was made. And the three things that firms, often kind of stumble over in these kind of situations is firstly, not having clarity of criteria around what exactly partners are being measured against. As to how they have defined what good looks like in terms of whether it's financial performance, contribution, behavior, leadership, all of those metrics. If they're not clearly defined and communicated to partners, then it's very difficult to hold partners to account against that criteria. Secondly, the other thing that firms often fall down on is around, as you've said, Corinne, around how they measure partners against that criteria. It's all well and good having beautiful KPIs set in stone in your partnership deed or in a policy, but if you're not actually measuring people against that criteria and being able to demonstrate how performance has been assessed over time through performance appraisal processes, etc., then it's very difficult to justify why you've made a decision to exit a partner based on their performance. And as you've said already, Corinne, around having a very clear paper trail around these things, actually having the criteria in place in the first place, and then having a proper appraisal process in place and paper trail around how that individual partner has been measured over time, so that you have contemporaneous records as to how that decision to, that finding that the partner has been underperforming and the ultimate decision to exit them has happened through the documentary trail. So I think unless you can get those three things right, you can be very much kind of, it can be challenging when it comes to exit discussions with a partner.
And Corinne, could I come in very quickly there? Because
Please do, yeah.
As Zulon has said, on exits, that's really tricky. But even within existing more flexible partner REM systems where there is up and down movement, you get all those things, don't you, Zulon, within people being moved down levels within a flexible system. So it's not just on exit. It's now within the lifeblood of lots of firms' REM systems.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, any decision around remuneration has to, it has to stand up to all those three criteria I mentioned. You need to be able to show why you've taken that decision and that it's been a fair one, and that you can actually provide documentary paper trail around it.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Zulon.
If you don't mind, Corinne, I'd just add to
Please,
that.
yes, Wonu,
So my perspective on it actually often comes into play for a lot of partners when they are challenging, for example, how they have been assessed. And they then often use what Zulon's talking about, as evidence of defects in the process, and they use that as leverage in their negotiations. So it's really important for obviously both sides, for the partners to understand how they're being assessed, but actually also on the other end, if you're thinking about litigating things and how you might best protect yourself, it's also important there as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a really important protection for the firm. I couldn't agree more. Zulon, I know we didn't discuss this when we were planning the discussion, but you were the one in our planning discussion that encouraged us to be fiercely practical. So apologies for a surprise question. But you were talking in sort of your second phase about kind of the importance of process and managing an appropriate process. I'm sort of looking at who's here. We know who the decision makers are because that's all set out in the policy or the documents. Who do you think should actually be leading that process and making sure that kind of, for example, the correct documentary evidence is generated, that actually that there is the checking in with partners to see the extent to which development objectives are being worked towards? Is that we often hear the sort of the question, is it a management job? Is it the senior partner? Is it the HR team? What do you think works well in practice?
I think it really depends on the shape and size of your partnership and your culture. In smaller partnerships, you'll often see management having a kind of a lead role in remuneration decisions. Medium-sized, larger partnership will have a remuneration committee who takes a lead on assessing partners and coming up with remuneration decisions at the end of that process. So it really depends. But I think the clear, whichever, whatever the size of your partnership and your governance arrangements, you need to have it kind of clearly documented as to how decision making will happen. Again, as Wonu says, one of the challenge points can be that there's a defective process, and unless you have a very clear process in place and clearly define who the decision makers are, what criteria they're going to be using in coming up with the decisions that they do, then it can be subject to challenge.
Interesting, thank you. Rob, if I may, I'd like to come back to the point that David was making about kind of the slight shift of emphasis in terms of focusing as a sort of a balanced scorecard as a means of delivering, say, the profitable work and profits kind of delivered to the P&L. And I wonder if you could sort of just touch on how firms are actually implementing these, and you mentioned the number of factors that firms need to adapt to. Are you seeing firms adapting already to the new ways of working, or is there kind of a lag between sort of recognizing now that the market is changing and the way that clients want to be served is changing, but are compensation systems changing with that at the same pace?
That's a really good question, and the general answer would be changing at a glacial pace. It's so difficult to change compensation systems because it affects everything else, and this focus on finance has always been there. I remember Arthur Andersen, that firm that went bang after Enron. They used to have a balanced scorecard system that they called the 4 pillars upon which our firm is founded. And the cynics in the firm used to call it a 1 boulder and 3 pebbles. The 4 rocks, sorry, not pillars, 4 rocks. And the boulder, of course, was economics. So it's always been there. And the shift from that is so difficult because the decisions are made by the most powerful people, the most influential people in the firm. And typically they are benefiting from the status quo. So it touches on culture as well. And I mean, if you define culture as what we reward and what we punish, if you like, in the firm, then there's no clearer statement of that than how you measure performance amongst your partners and how you compensate your partners. That is the mirror by which you can evaluate the culture. So when you hear firms say, we can do whatever you like, we can make whatever changes you like, so long as we keep our culture, that's often the most influential, most senior, most powerful partners saying, don't touch my comp. So yes, I don't expect to see massive changes in a year or two. But what's really interesting is that some firms are recognizing this. And I mean, this comes down to Clayton Christensen and disruptive innovation and how difficult it is for incumbents to shift. And what they're doing is they're creating little sort of digital native digital twins on the side, on the fringe of the firm, and testing new mechanisms, including performance and comp in those, and then slowly so the theory goes, build more and more of the existing firm into the new firm, and at some point it'll all come together. Because the other thing to remember is that if we look back in history, the incumbent firms typically have survived big disruptions like we're seeing at the moment. They haven't fallen. They haven't been overtaken by digital native, in this case, new entrants to the market. So I don't think we should all be planning for the demise of the magic circle and 50 firms below them. That's just not going to happen. They will evolve.
That's reassuring to hear, although you did start your remarks with the reference to Arthur Anderson. So, but thank you, Rob. No, I see that. And again, let's think really on a really practical level then. In terms, you sort of remarked on what you expect to see if you were advising a firm, and I know it will be very bespoke to each specific firm, but would you be advising firms to be sort of grasping that nettle now and trying to implement changes? Or do you actually think that stability, that slower pace of change actually does deliver for firms so that they're not sort of having a knee-jerk reaction to sort of market forces?
I would be advising them to find the areas within the firm where the pressure to change is inexorable, and to see if you can ring fence those areas, move them to the fringe, and see if you can transform those areas. Focus on focus on transforming those areas, but don't try to shift the super tanker with a single swing of the wheel. That just is not going to work.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And Zulon, obviously we've heard from Rob and David and around the kind of the trends that they're seeing and some of the thoughts on sort of the incremental changes that might happen, say, to balance scorecards or compensation systems. I know you spend a lot of time, or we both spend a lot of time advising firms on things like their structure, their governance, their compensation arrangements in the round when looking at the whole of their sort of constitutional setup. Are you actually seeing firms kind of reopening their constitutional documents or revisiting their policies or their REMCOM arrangements to sort of to reflect these trends in practice when you're helping firms with these things?
So the things that both David and Rob have discussed do absolutely resonate with what I'm kind of seeing from what can be often mean downstream from what sometimes Rob and David may be advising in terms of kind of strategy at the strategic level. When we come in to help firms look at their governance and their remuneration structure to update them to follow strategy. So what I'm seeing is that in practice there's a clear gap between what firms are saying in terms of what they want their strategy to be to actually what they're doing and what's actually in their governance arrangements. And there is a lag between the two. So most firms are not, as I think Rob and David already said, not really undertaking a wholesale redesign of their compensation systems, even though we are in a very fast-moving period of flux in the professional services sector around AI and PE investment, which we'll come to talk about, and the kind of big changes that are happening in the market. Instead, they are making those incremental changes and layering new expectations around, for example, increase focus on financial performance, for example, onto their existing remuneration frameworks. So that in effect, what that's doing is kind of increasing the level of complexity in the remuneration system. So rather than producing clarity, you often end up with systems that are harder to understand and harder to operate in practice. So alongside that, you're seeing increasing reliance on management or REMCO discretion because the system is much more complex. And that's partly because firms don't fully trust that their metrics are actually capturing contribution in this fast-changing environment. So from a legal and governance perspective, that does create risk. So where you have discretion and it's not clearly anchored and consistently applied, and Wonu will talk about how you can validly apply discretion in these situations, it does become harder to justify the outcomes and can be more susceptible to challenge by partners. So if I'm stepping back, what I would say is that strategy and behaviour is changing much more faster than firm structures and their actual partnership deeds and policies. Firms are becoming much more commercially focused and more performance driven, but the underlying governance frameworks aren't really keeping up with that. And I think my key advice to people would be, you need to do these things concurrently to avoid these kind of risk issues building up in the system.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And I think we will come on to sort of the impact of external capital in certain sectors and the kind of the different pace that we see with sort of externally backed firms. I think that's really interesting. Also interesting to hear that sort of we're seeing sort of some layering, but actually where we're observing the changes perhaps in the way that powers are exercised and the exercise of those discretions, rather than necessarily a change to the system, to Rob's point about sort of starting to turn the tanker. And I wondered, Wonu, if you could just give us a bit of a reminder about some of the challenges that firms can face, because it sounds great on paper, doesn't it? Oh, well, you've got discretion about how to exercise these powers, but it's not a real sort of true unfettered discretion, is it? There are guardrails, aren't there?
Yeah, indeed, Corinne. I think a lot of firms typically they will have that discretion. Maybe it's from just the managing partner making decisions on remuneration, or they might have a whole committee. They might have the fixed formula, the discretion, or a hybrid kind of mix of both. But in all of those circumstances, the key thing is that it's not completely unfettered. You have to exercise that discretion rationally, in good faith, not arbitrarily, not capriciously. Most people probably know that as a sort of, the term the Braganza sort of duty, which I think we've all become familiar with sort of applying now. Taking into account those things that are relevant and discounting those things that are irrelevant. It's that sort of Wednesbury reasonableness approach. What discretion doesn't mean is that you could just make any decision that you like and just move on. Taking that approach, taking that sort of process approach, that process discipline is important the more discretion that you have, for the reasons that we discussed earlier, because later down the line, if it is challenged for any reason, you will need to have paper trail, you need to have evidence of what you took into account and making sure that you didn't take something completely irrelevant into account. Also, obviously, depending on structure, some firms will be considering their duties of good faith and exercising that in the interest of the whole firm as well. Even if you're talking about a rainmaking partner, and I think we're going to come on to talk about sort of values and culture and things like that. Is exercising your discretion in the interest of the whole firm, giving this partner, allocating this partner this big pot of the profits when they've been potentially conducting themselves behaving badly in terms of in line with your sort of values. So even where firms are moving towards, or there is this kind of incremental change towards from balanced scorecard to focusing more on financials, they can't just completely, I think, drop the ball on what the bigger picture is going to be, because down the line, sort of looking downstream, if you want to say that, at how that might play out if partners come and challenge the decisions that have been made about their remuneration, which is what people care about mostly. You're going to need to have something in place to be able to defend that. Where I see also issues come in is where decisions are made, discretion is exercised, and firms aren't taking into account the potential sort of disparate impacts that might be had on other groups, for example. So, for example, you have maternity, parental leave, workers, partners, disability, age, all of those things might come into it at the end, when you're sort of trying to justify the decisions that's been made. And I think it's important for firms, again, not to just throw out the whole book and the structure, and to remember that actually what they're doing here is they're protecting themselves from risk down the line if they are implementing the full sort of the structure and the making sure they're applying the Braganza duties properly.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Wonu. David.
And what Wonu said there is really, really important. I want to echo her views. One of the things that I always try to get my clients to understand is that within the context of their REM decisions, whether that's a management committee or a REM committee, the way that they describe how they reach their decisions is very, very important. And that encompasses how much or how little discretion they give themselves over how they put those considerations together. And it is really important that then they follow that, obviously, because that if you don't follow that, then you're immediately giving rise to huge risk. The greater the discretion a management or REM committee has, generally reflects the amount of trust that exists within the partnership. the smaller the amount of discretion, the less trust you tend to see. However, having said that, what you've got to balance that with is that you want as close to one version of the truth as far as that firm is concerned as to what is going to be and what isn't going to be taken into consideration. And what's been fascinating for me on a couple of occasions, because I sit on as a sort of non-exec on some firms' Remcos, is we've had partners, elected partners, coming along to those meetings and coming along with their own version of the analysis generated via AI of the numbers that they're seeing produced by their practice management system that everybody sees, and saying, well, if we took this view, it would look quite different to the prompts that they've used, etc. So you can see how trying to stick to one version of the truth in a world which used to be reliant on essentially your chief financial officer and their view of how those numbers are looking in particular, or how the numbers are produced, you can get yourself into a situation where you are now being exposed to multiple ideas of what this could be telling us. So that's been a really interesting wrinkle in all of this. For good governance, again, within that process, my view is that you need to be clear about what it is you're going to take into account and how you're going to do it, as opposed to having allowing for alternative views of reality that take you away from what you've set out. But it's another interesting facet of how the AI analysis can creep into all facets of what we do.
I think that's right. And actually, as Wonu was speaking, it struck me that a lot of committees within firms or internal meetings will use AI as a tool for sort of keeping notes, sort of transcription, summarizing. And I can see that in some organizations that might be used in substitution, for example, for the notes of a meeting that perhaps an experienced HR professional might have made. And in my view, the HR professional probably will have had a thought about, from experience, will know the way that things ought to be recorded in a way that reflects, as you say, Wonu, sort of reasons for decisions and the kind of the real heart of the decisions made around remuneration. But you might not get that level of sophistication and nuance from, say, an AI transcription or a summary tool that might not have that experience to back it, or a partnership secretary or whoever is involved. And so I can see that just using those tech tools, although they're really valuable in some ways, could undermine that record keeping and that paper trail and be unhelpful from the risk perspective.
Yeah, and I think I'd just add to that, Corinne, when it comes to the sort of litigation side of things, those sorts of documents are the documents that partners will be requesting, for example, in a data subject access request. If there's discussions about their remuneration and how they compare to others, but it's just been done by an AI transcription, maybe some things that were discussed aren't the things that you want to be disclosed exactly the way that they were said, because there might be some nuance that's missed that, like you say, a HR professional might have noted down in a different way.
Exactly.
And Corinne, just to say that there are there are systems out there doing just that in relation to partner remuneration and Remco support, automating exactly that piece, and summarizing, for example, partners' self-reflection and submissions, which is a typical and common part of a review system, and it's probably going to get it right an awful lot of the time. But occasionally it is going to throw up something that doesn't get taken into consideration as being important, but which a partner is really wanting to rely on in terms of their submission. So, yeah, those gaps exist in all systems, but it would be wrong to suggest that the AI will do away with the need for really checking how against the source data. It's not his strength.
Really interesting. Thank you so much. Rob, I'd like to come back to the question of culture that you touched on when you were talking about kind of the compensation system and the way that you decide to reward a partner is very much a mirror to the culture that you have, and sort of and Wonu's points about the importance of encouraging the sort of desirable behaviours and values within the firm, and there's a lot to talk about that. And I wondered if you could just touch on whether the sort of the trends we're seeing, or the trends we're talking about in terms of the slight change of emphasis on the decisions around partner compensation because of the forces that we're seeing in the market. Could you see those affecting firms' culture?
Yes, definitely. It's worth just recapping very quickly what culture tends to mean in law firms. I mean, it's what we reward and what we don't reward, what we punish, what's tolerated. That really is the manifestation of culture. And there are aspects of that which are just like Myers-Briggs for law firms, differences. It doesn't really matter so long as they don't cause ructions when they come together, say in a merger. There are other aspects of culture that do align with performance. The degree to which there is a strong direction aligns with performance. The collaboration aligns with performance. It's been empirically proven by many people. So in those cases, there's a right and a wrong. It's not Myers-Briggs, different personalities. And what we are seeing is as there's a bifurcation developing within firms where as the more, to use that horrible term, commoditized work is process-driven work, I think is a far better term, it is sort of shifting down and coming under more and more price pressure, and firms are having to become more and more efficient at driving that. And to your point earlier, going after market share, because if the margin is shifting on that work, is shrinking on that work, then the way to keep the quantum of profit as opposed to the margin is to get more of that work. So that's one kind of a culture that's needed to drive that kind of behavior. And at the other end, at the more elite end, you've got that sort of the high billing partners that have got the high level of autonomy and all the tacit knowledge is in their brains. And that's a different culture again. That's what we've typically seen in the most elite firms, and I don't think that's changed very much. But things are changing so very, very fast. It's all this has emerged over the past year, 18 months, that we've gone from Harvey and Lagora appearing to Mike OSS appearing. Mike OSS, for those who don't know, was an associate at Latham and Watkins who went and built an equivalent of Mike and Lagora in 2 weeks and then put it on the web for free. And we're seeing Microsoft and OpenAI with their Codex Legal and Anthropic with their Claude Legal, and there's so much coming at us. So it's like having to absorb change through a fire hose. So I just caution against making huge decisions that are going to have multi-year implications without understanding and without building optionality into them. I think that's that's in itself a cultural attribute.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Wonu, we've been talking today about an honest focus on the boulder rather than the pebbles, in terms of an honest focus on the financial KPIs, and specifically sort of profitability and the scorecard sort of supporting that financial delivery. Some people, I suppose, might argue, well, that kind of strong focus on high financial performance could lead to perhaps an erosion of a firm's culture, that there's no place for kind of a positive firm culture in a sort of a high performance, financial KPI driven environment. I'd be interested in your views on whether you think that the two can be compatible.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in a high performance environment, it's not incompatible, I don't think, with a sort of kind culture. I know some people will disagree with that, but I think it's still possible to, and I think it is not just possible, but it is preferable and probably legally as well, and from a sort of compliance perspective, to be kind in the sense of having fair processes. The sort of genuine consultation that we were talking about, and having proportionate management action, and taking into account the things that are relevant and that are linked to your to your values, that are set out in your agreements. So, I'm not talking about sort of the sort of wishy-washy, let's kind of be nice to each other. They do have grounding, and a lot of them are actual, we're talking about sort of legal obligations anyway, that you would have, for example, under the Equality Act, to make sure that any of the criteria that you might be applying, as I was talking about before, doesn't disparately affect certain groups of people who are more likely to be affected by them. So I don't think they're incompatible. And actually, I think with I know we didn't speak about this too much, but and I'm going to leave it to some of my other colleagues who are more experienced in the regulatory field, but the SRA, for example, they've got that huge focus on workplace culture, and maybe they wouldn't call it kindness, but I think they would definitely say a focus, I guess, on ensuring that there is fair treatment and not discriminatory treatment. And I think if firms are ensuring that they are complying in that way, they're only setting themselves up for success, both from, I think, from a profit perspective, but also in terms of their people. If you look at it in the round, it usually leads to less tribunal cases as well, less attrition. I'm not saying those very high performing firms, those elite firms that Rob was talking about, would necessarily, I don't know if they would agree, and they would say, yeah, they would rather have the attrition rather have the attrition and take the profit. But I think both can be had side by side in a firm that is intentional, and in a firm that wants to comply with its compliance and regulatory obligations anyway.
I think that's a really important point on the regulatory side. Obviously, the SRA has been at the forefront for law firms, but we're seeing that follow, aren't we? For example, the FCA on the non-financial misconduct sort of changes and so on. So we are sort of seeing that regulatory tanker turn, I suppose, to use Rob's analogy. I don't know, Rob, maybe I'll come back to you. Do you think that firms can preserve their culture? You hear a lot when firms are talking about what makes them unique and what sort of is the glue that kind of keeps partners and talent within the organization. Is their culture, is their people and the way that they operate. Do you think that they can preserve their culture while sort of adapting a compensation system? And is preserving the culture, perhaps I've made a mistake there, but is actually preserving the firm's culture the same as retaining key people?
I think the more important question is, should they retain their culture? I mean, if the compensation system and the performance evaluation systems are indeed a mirror for what the culture is, and you need to change those because the market has changed, then surely one needs to change the culture too. And I think the key here is to be intentional about that. And to look, it's back to that first question that I opened with what's keeping managing partners awake. Is our compensation system, so is our culture preventing us from being able to do what we need to do to thrive? And if the answer to that is yes, then clearly the solution is be in an intentional and thoughtful way, think about how you need to change that.
Really, really interesting. Zulon, we talk a lot about we've talked about technology, but we've also talked about the influence of external capital in the various professional services sector. Obviously, there's been a huge period of change driven by external capital in the accountancy sector. Law, we're starting to see the influx of external capital. I mean, a lot of talk and not a lot of activity, but nevertheless, we think it is going to be influencing the market. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on how partner compensation systems either might or should change as a sort of a reaction to these different market forces changing sort of the competitive environment.
Yeah, so I think we're already seeing a shifting driven by the twin forces of AI and external capital in the market, but it's in slightly different ways. So with AI and technology, we're seeing a shift that's already mentioned by Rob and David before, that we're seeing a shift in what actually drives value in firms. So traditionally, compensation systems have been aligned to inputs, so hours, leverage, individual production. As firms increasingly adopt technology and AI, the value increasingly sits in other areas. So for example, collaboration, client ownership, and origination, judgment, and how technology is being deployed by teams and individual people to deliver outcomes for clients. So the challenge is that many compensation systems have not yet caught up with that shift in how pricing might be changing in firms because of the use of AI, for example, and how value is being delivered. So there's a real risk of misalignment where firms are investing in technology, but actually their compensation systems are actually disincentivizing the use of that technology because it's still valuing billable hours, for example, which is eroded by the use of technology because you're becoming much more efficient. On the external capital front, the effect is slightly different, but it kind of reinforces similar themes and the same direction of travel, in that PE investment is introducing much more greater focus on returns, financial returns, much more rigorous and formal governance systems and oversight, and greater scrutiny of performance, because investors are expecting a significantly high rate of return on their investment, and there's a timeline to that, and in order to meet that, you need to be pretty aggressive in your financial management of the firm and of individual partner performance. So that's tending to push firms towards much more clearer, much more data-driven, more defensible compensation systems, and driving how individual partners are being appraised and what kind of KPIs they're subject to. So when you take those two forces together, they're both moving firms away from much more traditional partnership models. We're probably going to see much more a greater erosion of locksteps, much more focus on individual contribution, not necessarily based on billable hours anymore, but actual kind of revenue contribution and profitability contribution. Moving away from that kind of trust-based system in a traditional partnership towards something that's much more kind of structured and performance managed. And that's quite a significant cultural change for many firms.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And I think I would add to that with the influx of external capital, depending on where a firm is or a platform is in its cycle of investment, there will be periods in that sort of cycle where they will have money to spend, and then those firms that haven't got external backings will be then fighting for the talent and be sort of trying to retain their partners, when actually those firms might have sort of big checkbooks to lure partners out of firm to drive that growth. So I think that the competitive pressures sort of on your firm from outside will be affected by those things that you've mentioned there. We're coming up to 10 minutes from the end, so if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat. And we've got a question here from Sikandar. Thank you so much. Good morning to you. I wonder, Zulon, if we could stick with you, and then I might come to you, David, as well. Sikandar asks about the most common remuneration systems in medium-sized law firms, and it's the literally $64 million question. Which is the most successful one in your view? I wonder if, Zulon, you might kick us off just with some thoughts on that.
Gosh, that is the $64 million question, isn't it? No two remuneration systems are ever the same in firms, even some firms that are kind of similar in size and broadly culture as well, because individual partnerships are very individual, and remuneration systems tend to be bespoke. But what I'm seeing is the most predominant model, certainly in the kind of UK headquartered professional services firms, is that balance between an element of lockstep that is managed versus an element that is driven by kind of individual contribution, so that it has flexibility to recognize exceptional performance in any given year, but also kind of rewarding longevity within partnerships and collaboration as well. So there tends to be a kind of mixture of two. But as I've said, these things are all being kind of rewritten as we speak because of the the flux that we're in as a kind of professional services market.
Thank you, Zulon. David, do those remarks resonate with what your experience and what you would consider to be common and successful?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all those systems in the medium-sized market are generally hybridized. Very, very few pure locksteps anymore, purely based on tenure, and where there tend to be very particular reasons for that. And over time, there's been a shift from what you might call managed lockstep, where there are gateways, but there's still a presumption of progression over time, to more of a managed merit basis where the presumption of progression is gone. Longevity is valued to some extent, but it's more about where your practice size and contribution ranks vis-a-vis your other partners. That'll tell you where you end up in that profit sharing ladder, I guess. So yeah, but as Zulon says, it's remarkable how individualistic each law firm's profit sharing structure is and their contribution evaluation structure is, even within firms that you, from the outside, you'd say, oh, they're very similar, aren't they? I mean, you can have quite different mechanisms.
That's interesting. Thank you. I would agree with that. And David, could I stick with you, please? Because Kate's raised a really interesting question, and I just, the subtext here is I want a really practical answer, please. She's asking for providing an example of how collaboration has been effectively measured. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's lots of ways people have tried to do it. I think the one that you come back to mostly is client penetration and work penetration. So you take the two strands there. So where is client work being done across the firm? Who's it being done by? And how penetrative is that across departments, across geographies? And how balanced is that? Because it's a measure of the extent to which that client is a client of the firm as opposed to individual partners. And that's, if you look at Heidi Gardner's work, that's one of the things that she stresses is, like, you've got to look at the data that flows from this. And then the same is true of types of work as well. How do types of work flow across the firm or jurisdictions? Because that tells you what barriers there are to maybe getting it done in the right place. Are people dabbling in types of, a little bit of tax advice here, a little bit of employment advice there? Not a good way to do it. So that penetration of work type and client is really important. There have been attempts to do nominated sort of partners give credit to each other for sharing work or collaboration, but anything that is self-generated is subject to gaming, and ultimately that type of stuff ends up almost being a meaningless set of data ultimately. So yeah, the penetration metrics, I'd say.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
There's a book on that. There's Heidi Gardner's book, strongly to be recommended if anybody wants to know about collaboration, specifically in law firms.
Brilliant. Smarter
Great.
collaboration.
Good read.
Great. Oh, look,
Yeah.
and there we've got
Go
Kate's read it, unfortunately, David. Nice try,
the AI summary.
We've got what reads like an exam question from Jonathan, but Rob, maybe you could just pick this up in a couple of minutes. I'm conscious of time. He asks about, to what extent is tenure still reflected as part of the managed meritocratic locksteps as a legacy of the old systems?
Especially in American firms. I remember some years back in the American Lawyer, there was an article about the hundreds of millions of dollars of work that were held by partners of 80 and above. So it's a far more common characteristic of the American firms than the British firms, where they tend to edge partners out at mid-50s. But it's still definitely an issue. But what's interesting now is the leveling of the power, as you get youngsters coming in that are AI native themselves at an individual level and can use these tools far more effectively than the old guys. But the old guys have got all the tacit knowledge and wisdom and judgment. So there's a real partnership that needs to develop in order to be able to adopt AI at an organizational level.
Thank you. Just very briefly then, before we finished, Wonu, I wondered if we've got a question here from Scott Jones, who's confessed to being deputy editor at Legal Futures. So just to be aware, he's a journalist, so no pressure. He sort of talks about bringing the three things together: values and culture, pay, and specifically refers to the fact that anecdotally, younger lawyers are not always aiming for partnership. Although, Scott, I've talked to a number of people who are entering the profession, and they would dispute that. But I wonder, but you do hear it said a lot. I wondered, Wonu, if you had any thoughts on how this these themes might be affecting a firm's financial model, and how firms pay talent. Sorry,
So
you've
how
only
is
got 30 seconds. To sort of that generational influence in terms of kind of compensating talent if younger lawyers coming through aren't aiming for partnership in the way that historically one might have said they were.
Yeah, well, I think some of the discussion we've had about the work that younger lawyers are might be doing now anyway, kind of falling out of the bottom. So I think they might maybe need to look at incentivizing them to do other types of work that they might find more interesting anyway, and that might keep them more kind of motivated to to aspire to the partnership. I don't know if it will be a sort of a different model of compensation that will truly motivate, but it could be a different way of working whereby you're not doing the grunt work, you're looking straight away at how to use AI to do the strategic work as a supportive tool, and thereby by hopefully sort of developing your skills much quicker. And as Rob was talking about, having that sort of that age-old, sorry, not to use that phrase, that knowledge, that embedded knowledge of that wisdom of more experienced colleagues, hopefully helping you along the way. So I think maybe it could just lead to the way that's measured looking different, but I think those sort of younger people coming through might still be there, but just looking for something different.
I think that's a really brilliant note to end on, and to reflect on the fact that change represents opportunity, and that all these sort of exciting things that are happening are ways, although we've got to grapple with how to adapt to them, they do represent opportunity for current generations and the next generations. So thank you, Wonu, for reminding us of that perspective. I'm afraid we have run out of time, as David just mentioned in the chat there. So I do want to make sure we're closed before 10. So I think I should probably just call it a day there. I'd love to thank all of the people who've put their questions in. That really makes it a much richer discussion. And specifically thank our panelists, Wonu, David, Zulon, Rob. Thank you so much. It's been really interesting. And thank you to you all for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks very much.